They built a god to rule us. We handed it back in pieces. The mask was her father's. K.L. Voss had found it in a lockbox underneath the floorboards of the old garrison post on Harrow Station. 3 weeks after the Dominion occupation began, and 2 days after they dragged Commander Voss out through the main gate and never brought him back. The mask was copper-woven mesh, formed in the shape of a face that wasn't quite a face. A neutral expression stamped from a material that didn't corrode, didn't melt, didn't register on Dominion bioscanners because it had been built before Dominion bioscanners existed. There was a folded note inside the box, written in her father's angular shorthand. It said, "Put it on when you have no other choice." You'll know when she'd kept it folded in her breast pocket for 3 weeks. She took it out sometimes at night and looked at it. She hadn't put it on yet. She told herself she wasn't ready. The Voss-Kale incident. That's what the Dominion called it in their communiques, she'd learned later. A bureaucratic label for the day they arrived at Harrow Station in force. 40 adjudicator class, drop pods, punching through the upper atmosphere. Each one carrying a Warden construct and its attendant handler squad. The constructs were what the colonists called irons. 8 feet of magnesium alloy frame, vacuum-sealed joints. Photoreceptors that could track a running human at 400 meters. They moved with a sound like a pressure door cycling. A deep mechanical exhalation on every step. And they did not stop unless their handler stopped them. The Dominion had arrived because of the work of a man named Set, Dr. Elon Set was 63 years old, slight as a folded paper crane, and possessed of the kind of mind that made people around him feel like they were thinking in slow motion. He'd spent the last 11 years developing a neural lattice relay, a compact device that could synchronize organic neural firing patterns with external mechanical systems. In plain language, a brain link that let a human operator control machinery with thought alone. The military applications were obvious to anyone. What wasn't obvious, what Set himself hadn't anticipated, was that the relay's synchronization code was genuinely universal. It didn't care what kind of machinery it was talking to. The architecture was that clean. The Dominion found out about it through an intercepted transmission. 40 drop pods later, the relay was what they'd come for, and Dr. Set's daughter Mira was the leverage. Kale heard about the yacht on the same morning. She pulled the Mac from her pocket for the 4th time, without putting it on. The colony's transport vessel, a mid-range hauler called the Cassidy, pressed into service as a civilian ferry since the occupation, was running supply runs to the outlying platforms. The Dominion had permitted this. They liked the colonists docile, kept fed, kept moving. What they'd done quietly, according to a dock worker named Petch who was sweating through his coveralls when he told her, was wire a threshold detonator into the Cassidy drive manifold. At 32 kilonewtons of thrust, the speed required to break Harrow Station's outer orbital ring, the detonator would fire. There were 63 people aboard the Cassidy at that moment, including Mira Set, who'd been escorted on at gunpoint. The Dominion wanted Dr. Set to know that each minute his daughter stayed alive was a minute the relay remained undelivered. They were counting on him to be reasonable. Kale put the mask on. It fit like it had been made for her face. The docking arm access hatch was poorly lit, which helped. The Dominion scanner post at the end of the arm was staffed by 2 handlers who were playing some variant of a card game on a folding table. Their irons standing dormant behind them in their recharge cradles, heads bowed like monks at prayer. Kale came over the top of the access arm in a maintenance crawl that she'd mapped 3 days ago, for reasons she hadn't admitted to herself at the time, dropped to the deck behind the scanner station, and disabled both handlers with the efficient, unheroic violence she'd learned in the garrison and practiced in the dark since the occupation began. Neither of them saw her face. Shh. The copper mesh was the last thing one of them saw before his vision went out, and he spent a long time afterward trying to describe it to his superiors, who concluded he must have been confused. She found the detonator's relay circuit under the Cassidy secondary manifold housing. Access through a panel so fouled with coolant residue that the Dominion technician who'd installed it hadn't bothered to reseal the cover properly. That was the thing about occupying forces KL had noticed. They believed so completely in the efficiency of their systems that they got sloppy on the edges. The detonator was a compact magnetic clamp model, anchored to the housing with 2 pins that required a non-standard driver bit to remove. She didn't have a non-standard driver bit. She used the butt of a signal flare. 3 taps of specific force, and an understanding of material fatigue that she'd accumulated over 26 years of fixing things that weren't supposed to be fixable. The detonator came free. She caught it before it could clatter on the deck, held it against her chest, like something sleeping, and breathed. 63 people made it off the Cassidy that evening, including Mira Set, who was 17 years old and furious in the particular way of someone who'd been frightened beyond the capacity for fear, and come out the other side burning. Kale was gone before anyone could ask who she was. The name spread faster than she expected. It started as the one with the copper face, which she understood, became the serpent, which she didn't anticipate, and settled eventually into something shorter and harder. The copperhead, she didn't choose it. Names like that choose themselves when enough people say them in the dark. Dr. Set found her 3 days later. She was in the maintenance tunnels, under processing block 7, running power assessments on a secondary comms array she was rebuilding from salvaged parts when she heard footsteps behind her that were too deliberate to belong to someone who didn't know she was there. She was on her feet with the mask in her hands before she'd consciously decided to move. "I'm not armed," Set said. He was smaller in person than she'd imagined, wearing a work coat 2 sizes too large, and carrying a battered toolkit as though that made him less conspicuous. His eyes were the same specific shade of gray as his daughter's, and they were looking at the mask with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I wanted to thank you, and to tell you something." "Tell me." "They have a working iron now. Fully operational Warden construct with my relay installed." She'd known this was coming. It didn't make it easier to hear. "How complete is it?" "Complete enough." He sat down on a conduit housing without being invited and pulled something from his toolkit. A folded schematic, dense with annotations in 3 colors of ink. Relay requires a synchronization signal from a control hub to manage the construct's locomotion. Without the hub signal, the construct's movement routines degrade. It can't maintain coordinated motion for more than 40 seconds. He held the schematic out. "The hub is here. Level 9 of the Dominion Command Facility. I know because I built it." Kale took the schematic. She studied it for a long time without speaking. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I can't go in there myself." He looked at his hands. "And because you're already going." She hadn't decided that yet, but he was right. Getting into the Dominion Command Facility required understanding something about Dominion architecture that took her a week to fully grasp. They built their facilities the way they built their irons, with tremendous confidence in the reliability of their own systems, and almost no thought given to what happened when those systems failed. Security at the outer perimeter was dense. Security in the interior was nearly non-existent, because in Dominion operational theory, if someone was in the interior, they'd already been processed by the exterior and were therefore authorized. It was a flaw so fundamental it had a name in old Garrison doctrine: concentric fallacy. Her father had lectured on it once. She remembered sitting in the back of the briefing room, 17 and resentful of the early hour, taking notes she'd later memorize without meaning to. She got in through a supply intake on the facility's eastern face, pressed into a crate of atmosphere processing filters that smelled of ozone and machine oil. She spent 4 hours in the dark, listening to the facility breathe around her, mapping the sounds to the schematic she'd memorized. The Dominion's interior corridors had a rhythm to them. Patrol cycles, maintenance drones, the deep thrum of the iron in its recharge cradle, somewhere below her, that she felt more in her molars than heard with her ears. Found the control hub on level 9. It was guarded by a single Dominion technician and 2 dormant irons in their cradles. And the hub itself was a tower of interconnected relay nodes, about the height of a man, humming with the soft blue luminescence of active synchronization fields. The technician was running diagnostics. She waited until he turned his back on the hub to retrieve something from a shelf. She crossed the room in 9 steps, disabled the technician without drama, and stood before the hub. She could destroy it. That had been the plan she'd brought into the room. Find it, wreck it, Get out. But standing in front of it, she saw something Set's schematic had suggested, but not confirmed. The hub wasn't just controlling the command facility's iron. It was controlling all of them. Every Warden construct on Harrow Station, 42 units, was linked to this hub, which meant whoever controlled the hub controlled the irons, could, theoretically, reprogram the construct movement routines. She stood there for a moment, thinking about her father's lectures on resource efficiency, on the principle that the best weapon is the one your enemy already built. Then she sat down at the technician's console and started working. She'd been in the facility for 6 hours when they found her. Not through any failure of her concealment. She'd been careful in the way that had become second nature over weeks of existing in occupied territory. They found her because one of the dormant irons in the recharge cradle registered an unauthorized signal query and flagged it to the duty officer, and the duty officer was, to his credit, thorough. 3 handler squads, 12 personnel, and behind them, walking with the measured step of someone who'd spent a long time learning to look unhurried. A figure she recognized from the occupation broadcasts. Adjudicator Vesson, who administered Harrow Station's occupation protocol, and who had, according to the intelligence she'd assembled, personally ordered the detonator placed on the Cassidy. Vesson was tall for his species. The Dominion ran to compact and angular in their physiology, but Vesson was something of an outlier, broad-shouldered and long-limbed, with the flat photoreceptive eyes of his kind set wide in a face that might have been handsome if it had any capacity for expression. He looked at Kale across the control hub with those flat eyes, and did not seem surprised. "The Copperhead," he said. His translation module gave it a tone of mild interest. The way someone might name a species of insect they were examining. "That's what people call me. You've been in my facility for 6 hours." A pause. "Alone. I work better alone. You were working on my hub." He glanced at the console. "I'm curious what you thought you were going to accomplish." She didn't answer that. She was counting the positions of the handler squads, measuring the distance to the door she'd come in through, running the math on whether any of the available paths out of this room ended somewhere other than in Dominion custody. None of them did. Vesson touched something on his wrist, a control surface built into his uniform, and behind her, the 2 dormant irons began to wake. She heard them before she saw them, that deep mechanical exhalation, pressure cycling, joints unlocking, the familiar sound of something enormous and indifferent coming to attention. "Bring her," Vesson said. The cell was 3 levels down, reached by a gravity-lock corridor that dropped at a 45-degree angle and required magnetic-soled footwear to navigate. Kale had neither the footwear nor, at this point, the freedom of movement that would have made it relevant. They walked her down with her hands secured behind her, and the irons walked behind them with that heavy measured tread. And she counted steps and angles, and noted the location of every access panel she passed. The cell itself was a cube of reinforced composite, approximately 4 meters on a side, with a single luminescent strip overhead and a floor grate over a drainage channel, bare and functional. The door was a blast-rated panel with a mechanical lock, not electronic, she noted, which was either an oversight or a deliberate choice by someone who dealt with people who were good with electronic systems. Vesson stood in the doorway after the handlers withdrew. "Dr. Set will give me the full relay specifications," he said. He was always going to. People are not as resilient as they imagine themselves to be. The flat eyes moved to the copper mesh mask, which they'd left on her face. She wasn't sure whether from oversight or as some kind of intended insult. "What I'm curious about is what you were actually doing at my hub console. Not destroying it. Something else." She said nothing. "It doesn't matter," Vesson said. "Whatever you input will be wiped when we run the diagnostic cycle." He stepped back. The blast door sealed. She stood in the silence and listened to the facility's rhythms for a long time. Then, she sat down on the floor, pressed her back against the wall, and began to think. The drainage channel under the floor grate was approximately 40 centimeters wide. She hadn't been intended to notice that. She had, because she noticed everything the same way she'd been noticing things since she was a child, following her father through garrison maintenance tunnels, and learning that every structure had a logic to it, A grammar of access points and pressure differentials and load-bearing compromises. And if you learned to read that grammar, you were never truly trapped. The grate was bolted from below. 4 bolts, quarter-turn mechanism. Accessible if she could get her fingers through the lattice, far enough to reach the bolt heads. She could not, with her hands bound behind her. She spent 40 minutes, working the binding loose, using the corner edge of the floor grate, which was sharper than the Dominion technicians had probably intended. And when her hands were free, she sat for a moment in the dark and let her wrists ache and thought about her father's note. You'll know when she'd put the mask on when there was no other choice. She was still wearing it, and she was still here, which meant there was still a choice somewhere, which meant this wasn't the worst it got. She pulled the grate free in 4 quarter turns, lowered herself into the drainage channel feet first, and started moving. The drainage system ran beneath the entire level, connecting to a maintenance access corridor that connected, in turn, to the facility's industrial processing section on level 3. She navigated it by feel and by the schematic she'd memorized, moving through spaces too narrow to stand upright, over the sound of her own breathing and the distant mechanical rhythm of the irons on patrol above her. The maintenance access corridor led her out into a room full of industrial chemical storage. Tall, cylindrical tanks on wall-mounted racks, labeled in Dominion Minnative script, that she'd spent 3 weeks learning to read. She found what she was looking for in the second row. Atmospheric solvent concentrate used for cleaning Dominion equipment, specifically rated for dissolving the lubricant compounds used in Warden Construct joint assemblies. She filled 3 containers from the storage tap. Onto maintenance workers' instinct, the habit of taking what was available and thinking about what it was for later. She was already thinking about the hub on level 9, and the irons sleeping in their cradles, and the 40 seconds of degraded locomotion that Set had promised her. Getting back to level 9 was harder than getting out of the cell had been. The facility's security response was active now. She could hear it in the change in the patrol rhythms, the increased frequency of the iron's pressure cycling footsteps, the clipped audio bursts of Dominion communication in the corridors above her. They knew she was out. They didn't know where she was. She used the ceiling. The Dominion built their maintenance shafts with standard traversal fittings every 1.5 meters, designed for their own maintenance drones, but passable for a human with patience and a good grip, and the ability to hold completely still when a patrol walked beneath her, close enough that she could see the detail work on the nearest iron's photoreceptor housing and smell the faint metallic tang of its cooling fluid. She reached level 9 through a ventilation junction. She dropped into the corridor outside the control hub. She walked through the door. The hub was active. Not just running, active. Running a full synchronization cycle, which meant the iron in the facility's main holding area was mobile, which meant Vesson had accelerated whatever operational timeline he'd been working toward. The luminescent blue glow was brighter than before, pulsing with the rhythm of the synchronization signal, and the 2 irons in the cradles beside it were fully awake now. Heads up, photoreceptors tracking. They tracked to her. The pressure cycling started. She heard the joints unlock. 8 feet of magnesium alloy frame, each one, stepping out of the cradles with that slow and indifferent purpose. She threw the first container of solvent at the nearer one. It hit the construct mid-torso, spread across the joint assemblies of both shoulders and the upper chassis, and the effect was immediate and alarming. Not the clean dissolution she'd hoped for, but a violent chemical interaction with the cooling fluid that ran through the iron's frame, generating a heat bloom that lit the construct's internal sensors, sent it staggering. Photoreceptors swept wildly. The movement routines fractured. The gait became asymmetric, one arm swinging independent of any command while the iron lurched toward her, like a falling tree, making up its mind about which way to fall. She moved. The second iron was faster, its gait unaffected, and it caught her with one arm. Not a grip, just a contact, a glancing blow from something that weighed 600 kilograms moving at 3 meters per second, and she hit the wall hard enough to lose most of a breath and a few seconds of clear thinking. When the world came back, she was on the floor with her ears ringing, and the damaged iron was down and thrashing, its degraded movement routines sending it through spasms that kept knocking its frame against the hub's relay nodes, and each impact sent a pulse of interference through the synchronization field. 40 seconds of degraded locomotion. She counted from the moment she'd hit the solvent. She was at 31. The second iron stood over her, and reached down. She threw the second container of solvent point-blank into its face. The photoreceptors went first, then the joint assemblies of the neck, the solvent eating into the lubrication channels, the head going rigid and locking in a 90-degree list to the left so that the iron stood there, swaying with its head at a permanent tilt. Like a question it couldn't ask, she rolled clear, retrieved the third container, climbed the hub. From the top of the relay tower, looking down through the grating on the upper housing, she could see the synchronization nodes, the master relays that pushed the control signal out to every iron on Harrow Station. She opened the third container. She poured it through the grating. The sound the hub made when the solvent hit the nodes was not a sound she'd been prepared for. It was large and structural, a groaning that resonated through the composite walls of the room, and the blue luminescence shuddered, fractured, strobed. The synchronization field collapsed in sections, relay by relay, and through the walls she heard, or imagined she heard, the sound of irons across Harrow Station, losing the signal they'd been built around, their movement routines degrading, their coordination dissolving into noise. She came down off the hub as the door opened. Vesson stood in the doorway with 4 handlers behind him, and a sidearm in his hand, and the flat eyes moving across the scene. The 2 irons disabled, the hub failing, the human standing in the wreckage of 600 million credits of synchronized military hardware, still wearing a copper mask. He raised the sidearm. She threw the empty container at him. As a weapon, as a distraction. A half-second of instinctive flinch response that she'd counted on, because she'd observed that Vesson, beneath the studied calm, was not used to things being thrown at him. In that half-second, she crossed the distance between them and put him on the floor with a joint lock that her father had taught her at age 14 and that she'd used exactly 6 times since with consistent results. The handlers raised their weapons. "The hub is down," she said. Her voice was level. She wanted it to be. "Your irons across the station have degraded locomotion. You have right now approximately 60 seconds before your occupying force loses coordinated mechanical support across all 37 active sectors. That, you have whatever you brought in your drop pods before the irons came online." She paused. "That's not enough." One of the handlers looked at another handler. "Look." That particular look of people measuring the gap between the plan and the current situation was something she'd seen on human faces too, and it meant the same thing in every species she'd encountered. "The plan is not working. Adjudicator is alive," she said. "He stays that way if you stand down." The formal cessation took 11 hours. It involved a great deal of communication between Vesson and the Dominion Regional Command that she wasn't party to, and a great deal of communication between Dr. Set and the station's Zealot Council in a council that she was, increasingly, expected to participate in. She stood in the council chamber in the copper mask for as long as she could justify it. She'd known all along that the mask was a borrowed thing. Father had worn it before her, and there'd been a copperhead before him. Probably. The mask's construction was old, older than garrison doctrine, older maybe than the station itself. It was a piece of something that got passed on when it was needed, and laid down when the need passed. She wasn't attached to it. She told herself that. When Mira Set walked into the council chamber and looked at her across the room, 17 years old and furious and alive, and carrying her father's battered toolkit because she'd gone back and picked it up after the Cassidy, Kale found she was already pulling the mask off before she'd consciously decided to. She held it in her hands. The copper mesh caught the chamber light and threw small bright arcs across the ceiling. Mira's expression moved through several things very quickly. Recognition, something complicated. Then, settling, the kind of look someone gives you when they've been carrying a question for a long time. And the answer turns out to be smaller than expected, but more real. "It's you," Mira said. "It's me." Dr. Set, standing behind his daughter, looked at the mask. His voice was careful. "What happens to it now?" Kale turned the mask in her hands. The mesh was undamaged. Copper didn't corrode, didn't melt, didn't register on bioscanners. Whatever came next, there would be a next. The Dominion would send another adjudicator. Someone else would come up with a plan that required technology they were willing to threaten children to obtain. It goes back in the box, she said. She folded it. She set it on the council table until it's needed again. Later, much later, when the garrison history got written in the formal terse style that garrison histories always took, stripped of texture and smell, and the specific weight of things held in dark spaces, someone would note that the occupation of Harrow Station lasted 41 days, terminated by the destruction of a Dominion synchronized control hub by a single operative using improvised chemical agents, and resulted in the withdrawal of Dominion forces pending regional review. The operative was listed as Kale Voss Garrison Auxiliary, no other designation. The people who'd been on the Cassidy that first night knew a different name for her, and they used it in the way people use names that have turned into something heavier than a word. Quietly, the way you'd talk about something that mattered so much you didn't want to wear it out. Mira Set kept the toolkit. She added a small copper snake figure to the keyring. She'd found the design in her father's notes, along with a notation that said, "Leave it with the ones you helped, so they know who to call." She thought that was probably the most human thing she'd ever read. She thought it from a species that had given the galaxy fire, fermentation, a baffling obsession with symmetry and architecture, and the specific stubborn gene that made a person climb a 600-kilogram mechanical killing machine to pour cleaning fluid in its face. She thought, yes, that sounds right. In the morning, on the inside of the box where Kale had locked the mask away, someone had left a note. Mira found it when she was cataloging the garrison archives 6 months later and almost didn't recognize the handwriting until she looked at it for a long time. It said, "For whoever comes next below that in a different hand, older, the ink slightly faded, were 4 words. You'll know when."